My name's Ecko Rowan Hutchinson, and I'm half English, half Indonesian. I was born in Bradford, but I've spent a lot of time sort of traveling the world. Once I reached about the age of 3, we moved to Australia, and then we moved to Indonesia to go see my dad's family, and we stayed there for a couple of years. And then I've just moved back to England, and well, I moved back 10 years ago, not just recently, but I've been in Hull for about a decade now, and it's been quite a good experience. I like living here just as much as anywhere else. Like,
Okay. So you did mention that you're mixed from your mixed heritage background is Indonesia and England. So how do you? I mean, I know the two countries have very different cultures, if I'm correct. So how do you see yourself? Are you more Indonesian or more? Are you more British? How do you reconcile that?
um, I'm sort of neither at this point. Part of the issue with being from two very different cultures and living in many different countries is that you feel like you're a foreigner everywhere. You don't feel like you necessarily fit in anywhere at all. And as a result, I feel like I've become distanced from both sort of cultural backgrounds. I'm not properly English and I'm not properly Indonesian either, sort of somewhere in between.
Oh, very interesting. Okay. So what? Where? I mean, was you born in England or was you born in Indonesia?
I was
Sorry.
born in England, in Bradford, just near Leeds.
Right. So at what point did you go to Indonesia? Did you spend some time in Indonesia at all?
Yeah, yeah, from about the age of 6 till like 9 or 10, I left Australia because my mum had gone there to do some English teaching as part of a work visa, and
Yeah.
then her visa ran out, so we had to go somewhere. And my dad suggested that we move to Indonesia so it could be closer to his family and spend some time in, his the place where he grew up. And
Oh.
yeah, I stayed there for 4 years. At the time, it was a huge portion of my life, but now I've spent so much time away from Indonesia and not actually living there that I can. It's not really a vivid memory.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So what about culture-wise? I mean, what do you find maybe main differences between Indonesian culture and British culture
Um,
from your own experience?
well, growing up in Indonesia was I wasn't as exposed to things as I would have been as an adult. But even at a young age, I was exposed to like the domestic side of it and more of the sort of traditionalist, very traditionalist upbringing. Like in England, it's sort of considered sensible to raise children the traditional way, in the same way as it is in Indonesia, like bringing them up so that they know discipline and having a rigid family structure. But in Indonesia, it was always much more sort of it was much less about your kids liking you and more about your kids becoming rounded people. My
Mhm.
dad was always a bit. I don't want to go massively into detail,
No,
but
no, of course
yeah,
not. All right, well, we get a picture. So what would you say are the similarities between Indonesian and British culture?
I feel like there's a lot of individualism in both communities. There's a drive to better yourself in the kind of communities that I was in Indonesia because we had quite a lot of money being from another country. We came over and the exchange rate was very poor for them, so we were bumped up from like middle class to sort of low upper class, and it was a very sort of bourgeoisie way of growing up. Like, I don't feel like I had that much connection to the actual Indonesians, it
Hmm.
was more like the international and sort of like foreign people living in our neighborhood. But
Okay.
i did i did I did live in River Park, which was it was a gated community sort of, but without the gates, and there was a local village nearby that was about 5 minutes from my house, and that was sort of the most exposure I had to Indonesian culture, and it was sort of the poverty in the average Indonesian village made it so that there was quite a lot of differences in what people actually had, but in terms of what people wanted, it was still the same. Like, people wanted to move into the big cities and become more successful, and so on. One thing I didn't fail to notice as a child was sort of the views on people's color of their skin. You know, like in England, people sort of a white person in England appreciates the tan, you know, because it shows that you can go on holiday, that you can go and be in the sun, and like you're making enough money that you don't have to grind away forever. But in Indonesia, growing up, I realized that a lot of my classmates that were from richer backgrounds had significantly whiter skin, and it wasn't just because they were like more white than Indonesian, but also because there's like skin whitening products, and their parents would keep them indoors to make sure that they didn't get dark. There's this whole emphasis on being as white as possible to seem successful and rich, and like you stayed indoors in the air conditioning doing like a desk job instead of being out picking bananas or something. And everyone in the village that was near my community, they all of them were darker skinned because they spent all day working outside, and there was a banana plantation and everything. So there was a lot of hard labor involved in their job. And then it was sort of a very disconnected reality for me because I spent all of my time, you know, not doing anything anyway because I was a child. I didn't work, and I didn't I didn't even have to do much at all. Like growing up, we had enough money to afford servants. So it was a very different upbringing from most Indonesians in that like I'd play with toys and then they'd just get cleaned up. I didn't even know that I had to clean up my own toys until I was about 9, and I
Right.
caught one of the maids cleaning them up, and I was like, "Whoa! They don't just put themselves back on the shelves." It was very weird.
Wow, that's interesting, man. Ah, okay. So, hmm, if you, if that, I mean, if you're blessed with a child in the
Mm.
future, um, you did mention that you feel like you somewhere in the middle between Indonesia and England. So where would you base? I mean, what kind of cultural lesson would you give your child? Or what would you pass on based on your experience to your child? How would you prepare him to?
Well, I'd hope that I could pass on some kind of middle ground, you know, like because being in the middle sort of teaches you more cultural sensitivity, and like because you aren't really from either place, you have to reconcile that in your own head. And it becomes a lot easier to just empathize with other people. I'd hope that if I did have kids, I could raise them up so they don't have many prejudices at all. Like, because it was in Southeast Asia, there is quite a lot of prejudice, and I wouldn't want them to adopt those kind of values from Indonesia. But there are plenty of values in Indonesia that are good, like acceptance of people of other races isn't the main thing. Like, it's not so much racism as it is situationism. Like in the Philippines and Singapore and Indonesia and Malaysia, all of the like class boundaries and discrimination is based off of like how much money you make and like what you look like, but not so much based on your heritage. It's like your current situation and where you are right now. And
Mhm.
I'd hope that I could at least pass on the values of not judging people by where they're from, and you know, trying to be more accepting while trying to not encourage that kind of behavior in them, you know, because it's
Okay.
similar in England in a sense in that you sort of judge people by where they are more now because racism isn't quite as you know blasé anymore. They can't just say, oh, white people are better than black people. They have to
Yes.
start coming up with reasons as to why. So there's a lot more sort of underhanded racism in my upbringing.
Very interesting. Um, I do. I mean, I understand that you're also a musician.
Hmm.
So do you? I mean, do you have any influences, any Indonesian within your music? I mean, been any influence or?
There was a pop artist that was very big in Indonesia when I was young, Iwan Fals,
Right.
and it's very cheesy, but it's always been sort of a bit of an influence on me because you know, obviously growing up, I'd just sort of like sing his songs to myself in Indonesian, and it's a big bummer for me really that I can't speak the language very well anymore. I haven't spoken it in over 10 years, so I'm completely out of practice, and I can't even like I can
Yeah,
remember the odd words, and it's just if I took lessons again, I think I could learn it,
probably.
and
Yeah.
I think I really should just to reclaim some of that culture because being bilingual was definitely a help, and I could start doing some more translating stuff and just like understanding my own culture better because I understand the words again. Growing up as a child, it was really easy to understand Indonesian, because it was just sort of like everyone around me was speaking it, and I was learning it at school. And I feel like maybe one day I'm gonna try doing some sort of Iwan Fals like vocals just in my own time, and never in front of anyone else, of course. But you know, there's maybe an easy way back in because of the musical connection.
Sounds good, man. So, I mean, eventually you would maybe try to fuse between your, because you told me your the kind of drumming you're into right now. I mean, it's more of like rock kind of style. So maybe in the future you'd fuse that with some of that influence as well. You know, when you get back into.
Definitely, there's a type of percussion, orchestral percussion in Indonesia called gamelan, and even though that stuff's a little bit beyond me right now, I'm hoping that someday I'll be able to take some of those beats and actually put them on a drum kit, because I think that would either sound really good or at least just really mental, even if it's not good. It's better than nothing.